Thank you for joining today's webinar, Ewe Nutrition in Containment. My name is Jodie Rizzo-O'Brien and I'm one of the AWI Extension SA team. The webinars are, this is the second in our series of 3 webinars, and they're supported by Australian Government's Future Drought Fund, the Government of South Australia, Livestock SA, the South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub, and Australian Wool Innovations Extension South Australia. Today's webinar has been recorded and we'll upload the recording to the AWI Extension SA YouTube channel in the coming days. We welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself or share it with friends. Today's presenter is Deb Scammell from Talking Livestock. Deb is a livestock consultant who assists producers with nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. She consults directly to farmers and runs industry courses and projects, and Deb is based in the Clare Valley. Prior to starting her business, Talking Livestock, Deb worked in the commercial nutrition space in several different roles, covering technical, sales, and national management. Deb has also been involved with sheep genetic programs, DNA, EID technology, and extension and sheep research. Deb graduated from the University of Adelaide with a Bachelor of Agricultural Science with honours in Animal Science, and has studied ruminant nutrition post-graduation. So at this time, I'll hand over to Deb. Thanks, Deb.
Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. So tonight I'll just be touching on nutrition and containment, which, pretty critical at the moment with many people with stock in due to dry times. But first I'm going to go through just what you actually need to have an effective containment program. So, we're looking at what the ewe actually needs to meet requirements as they're in those pens. Sorry, my cursor is not working for some reason. There we go. Next, we'll look at dollar value and what's the best feeds to feed when you're in containment, which obviously varies year to year with our commodity prices changing. I'll step you through a bit of an example ration and how you can work out sort of rations for containment feeding that are effective and sort of avoiding those health issues as well. I'll touch on at the end sort of mineral requirements, and I'll also touch just quickly on water quality as well when they're in those pens. So kicking off first with what those ewes need, I really like this sort of picture of the triangle. Basically, we're just looking at the start, the 3 crucial things when they're in containment. So we've got there the metabolizable energy or energy requirement of that ewe. So for anyone that's done lifetime ewe course before, or any industry programs, you'll know that ewes, we often just concentrate on the energy requirement of that ewe. So very similar to calories for humans. So basically, depending on mature body weight, we've got that energy requirement per day for maintenance. And then if we're trying to gain condition in containment, we're going to be looking for a bit more energy. If we're trying to drop condition a bit less. And then, if we're providing too much energy in the containment pen, you'll find the ewes are going up in condition score. And if you're not providing enough, they're going to be going down in condition score. So that energy is critical to meet our targets at the end, basically for lambing. So when we talk containment feeding, in my mind, the whole goal of this program is to not only get stock off the paddock, but we want to get them effectively through to lambing, so you actually get the result that you're after for all of your effort. So as I talk through, there'll be plenty of things I say sort of with health or correct condition score, and in the back of my mind is always trying to educate, I guess, that we're going to get the result we want at the other end. So the next thing at the top of the triangle there is the crude protein. So when we look at crude protein, when we look at young growing stock, anytime they're trying to put on sort of meat and muscle, we've got a huge protein requirement. But when we look at ewes, it's very similar when they've got that young lamb or fetus kind of growing inside them. So as they're getting closer to lambing, you're going to have that protein percent going up. And then during lactation as well, if they're still locked in or supplementary fed, you're going to have a larger protein requirement again. And that basically helps them produce high quality milk, which helps the growth rate of that young lamb. So your protein's measured in percentage and is critical any time you've basically got growth occurring, whether it's within the ewe or in a young animal on its own. The last one that I'll talk substantially about is NDF, or neutral detergent fibre. So that's the fibre content of the feed that controls intake, that's already also measured in percentage, and I'll go through that a little bit more later. At the bottom, I've got your macro minerals in the middle there, which I'll touch on: calcium, magnesium, both relatively critical later. And we've also got micro minerals and vitamins, which I'll touch on at the end of the webinar too. So, you know, just pointing out the barrel concept, which I really like. So, you know, the hard thing with a containment ration is it is intensive feeding, you know, similar to your poultry or pig sheds, really. They're off a paddock, they're in a pen. Everything they can access is what you're putting down their throat. So it does get a lot more critical that we actually meet all of those things and make sure there's not one minimum resource that's letting us down. So, you know, protein's a good example. Often people will meet an energy requirement with ewes but miss the ball on protein. And for twin-born lambs, you know, in that last trimester, that's what's going to help you get larger birth weight lambs and higher survival. So, you know, your minimum protein will then hold back that lamb birth weight and reduce your lamb survival at the end as well. So when we talk nutrition, just pointing out some basic terminology, when we're talking protein, energy and fibre, we're actually looking at what's contained in the dry matter portion of the feed. So, you know, I find there's a lot of confusion around this with rations, but dry matter is literally just the portion of feed that doesn't contain water. So if you dry your feed out, the water disappears. So your as-fed portion contains the water. And, you know, the easy ones are grain and hay. They're always around 90% dry matter and around 10% water, give or take. Once you get to other products like silage or some of the byproducts, silage is more like 30 to 40% dry matter and 60 to 70% water. So that's where we need to be comparing ingredients on a dry matter basis. So as we go through rations later, we'll be looking at energy requirement and energy provided from ingredients on a dry matter basis. And then before you feed, we convert it basically back to as fed by dividing it by the dry matter percentage. So, you know, I need to touch on this before we talk about what ewes need, because as I said on the first slide, with your energy requirement, it does vary a lot depending on the mature size of that ewe. So as I said, it's similar to calories for humans. So, you know, larger frame humans have a larger maintenance requirement and smaller frame humans will have a smaller calorie sort of maintenance requirement. So no different to sheep. So we actually need to know what the standard reference weight or the standard mature weight of that ewe is. So what we do is we weigh ewes, and a lot of people say, you know, our ewes are 85 kilos, but they may be in condition score 4. So we actually want to know what the ewe should weigh if it's in condition score 3. So you need to condition score your 50 ewes, work out an average score. If they come up at 3.5, we basically take off 7 kilos per condition score. So if your ewes are in score 3.5, we'll take off 3.5 kilos off that weight you've got over your scales to work out what they should weigh in condition score 3. And same with the wool. So we want a bare shorn weight. If they've got 6 months of fleece, just take off your 6 months standard fleece weight. If you've got 12 months of fleece, you'll take off that 12-month fleece weight. We also want them non-pregnant. So the ideal time is to weigh them, you know, sometime after weaning before they're joined again. Very, very early in gestation, okay, but we don't want the weight of the fetus changing that standard reference weight. And also no gut fill. So if they haven't been emptied out, we take 5% off that weight as well, just for the gut fill we're taking account of. So, you know, we really want to adjust it back to a standard mature weight. And the reason is all of our energy charts that we look at are based around the mature size of that ewe. So I've just put up a example of the energy requirements of a 60 kilo ewe. So, you know, we're going to go incrementally up if that's a 70 kilo ewe, and it's going to be lower if it's a 50 kilo ewe. So that is really critical when we're feeding to an exact energy requirement, that we're looking at the correct mature weight. So as you can see, you know, I find feeding dry stock relatively easy, or as you're coming into your joining period? Because as you can see on that graph on the left here, you've basically got that real stable requirement. So, through to post-joining, a couple of months after mating, you've got that stable maintenance requirement of 10 megajoules per day of energy. And then as you're starting to get closer to lambing, you've got this real solid increase of energy going in. So, depending on when you're containment feeding versus when you're lambing, your rations can end up changing sort of every 10 days. So when we look at sort of lifetime wool charts or energy charts, you will get different energy requirements from day 90, 100, 110, 120, 30, 40, and 150 at lambing. So, if you're trying to maintain condition score of the ewe or increase or decrease, it's important that you're meeting those changing energy requirements. Otherwise, if you're just providing maintenance, you're going to end up with quite skinny ewes at the point of lambing and quite small lambs. So that's where those requirements come from. And then we've also got this twin requirement that's substantially higher than the single, and just because they've got those two fetuses inside them. So, in an ideal world, you'll be feeding your twins and singles separately. Otherwise, in a containment pen, I find you're just underfeeding twins to basically overfeed singles. So you end up just doing a bit of a midpoint between the two lines, and often end up with large single lambs and light twin lambs. So not an overall effective program. And this season, if you've lambed early and you're unfortunately feeding into lactation, you can see you've got that huge increase in energy sort of post-lambing. So it peaks around 30 days after the lamb's been dropped. That's when they're consuming quite a lot of milk out of that ewe. So again, you'll have significant weight loss of a ewe if you aren't able to meet those requirements with supplementary feeding. As I said, there's many charts. A lot of them have come out of the grass-fed program. This one's from Ruminant Standards of Australia. The lifetime wool charts are really good as far as showing us what the requirements are. But yeah, in general, as we've said, based on ewe weight, we've got charts that'll give us a difference between confinement-fed ewes and paddock grazing ewes. And that's just the difference in energy that those ewes are needing associated with moving around. So often if they're locked up in a traditional sized containment pen of sort of 5 to 10 square metres a ewe, you potentially can reduce your energy slightly from what they're using when they're grazing and walking around, especially if it's a large paddock. So once you get, as you can see here, once you're getting into mid-pregnancy, the requirements are starting to increase significantly. But as I said, if you are doing rations and you've got ewes getting to that pointy end where they're in nearly right up to lambing, then, the requirements really need to be met every 10 days as they're slowly increasing into that lambing period. And you can see there the significant figures we touched on during lactation. Protein, as I said, I find is often missed in containment rations. So, this is probably a bit of a guide at the bottom of where I sort of try and hit for nutrition with your protein percentage. And I find often with a lot of people using sort of straw and barley rations or low quality hay and barley, often we are a bit under the mark in protein once we get through from sort of mid to late pregnancy. So, my targets would be probably a minimum of sort of 8% when you're on maintenance and early pregnancy. Once you get into mid-pregnancy, I'm going to be trying to be up around that 10% overall ration protein. And then during late pregnancy and into lactation, more that 12 to 14% protein. And especially with twin merino lambs, if they are slightly smaller, that 14% protein during the last part of pregnancy can really help with that lamb birth weight and survival where there's multiple lambs kind of on board, just because all of the nutrition is being split across two fetuses. So, we've got that note at the bottom. Ewes carrying twins will have a 15% higher energy requirement than single bearing ewes, and triplets again, even higher. So it's important we meet those if we can. So, one of the things I think we've been plugging for years really, and I'm finally starting to see a lot of feed testing being done. But when we talk about all these U requirements and how we're going to meet them, it's really hard to do a precise ration and make sure we're meeting daily energy when we don't have an actual feed test or a exact result on the feed. So, you know, especially with things like hay, there can be a huge variation in the quality of the hay that you're feeding, and that'll have a huge difference on what energy you're likely to be getting per day from fibre alone. You know, and that's probably the basis for all my rations, is that I look at sort of what they're able to get out of the fibre source, and then we're sort of topping it up with grain. So when you look at a feed test, so, you know, there's quite a few different companies that do feed tests. I use Feed Test in Victoria, which is the agri-food technology shown at the top of that sheet. It's around $60 for a feed test, and I think just gives you so much extra information about your feed type. So, you know, not to confuse you with all this information here, but I'll just point out the things I want you guys to be taking notice of. So we've got the dry matter percent. So as I said, that's just the portion of the feed that contains the nutrients without the water. So, you know, you can see here in this 23 cereal hay, we've got 85.6% dry matter. The crude protein there, so the crude protein's quite good for a cereal hay at 11% of the dry matter. So as you saw from my guides before, that's going to get you through really nearly into mid-pregnancy with that hay alone. We've then got the NDF figure, so the neutral detergent fibre, which determines how much of this fibre they can intake, so sort of fit through their rumen in a day. That's 51%, so quite low fibre level for hay. And then we've got the metabolizable energy at just over 10, so at 10.2 megajoules per kilo dry matter. So, you know, that's a pretty high quality hay. But yeah, I'm just going to touch on the NDF differences with feeds. So yeah, I guess I recommend you sort of test all your feed types, so especially your cereal grains and your hays, silage, anything else you're using. But I find realistically in a containment ration, it's definitely the fibre components that differ the most. So if you're only going to be doing some ingredients, I'd be doing the cereal hay, straws, silage, anything fibre based. And the reason, as I said, you know, when we look at feed ingredients, there's so many different ways we can meet daily energy requirements in a containment ration. But my preference is to fill them up basically with fibre, or work out how much of a fibre source they can eat, and then top them up with the grain portion. And, you know, that's just from years of sort of project work in the containment space, containment feeding with clients. I'll touch on some of the health issues we see later, but, you know, I'm really all about rumen function. So sheep, ruminants and cows, basically their rumen, or the fermentation vat that processes all the feed, was set up to process fibre. So they are fibre digesting animals. Yeah, when you look at acidosis and some of the other issues we have in containment, some of the deficiencies, it's often due to the rumen not functioning as it should. So yeah, my preference is to have the stock full of fibre sort of over a 24-hour period, or being able to access it when they can. So when we look at the NDF level on those feed tests, basically when we get to really high NDF feeds or high fibre feeds, basically it's just digested quite slowly through the rumen, and there'll be a limit to how much they can eat in a day. So we'll find with ad lib access, the rumen capacity will be filled, and they'll have a lot less intake as those high fibre feeds go into the rations. So I'll explain this using probably my favourite containment equation, which is, it's basically come out of the dairy industry. It's applicable to all ruminants. So it's basically 120 divided by the NDF of that feed, so that neutral detergent fibre figure that I just showed you on the feed test, is basically the percent of the mature body weight, or the standard reference weight of intake that animal's likely to get in a day. So if you use this to do your containment rations, it means that, you know, even if you've got a bale of straw or a bale of good quality hay in the pen, We know exactly how much of a percent of body weight that animal can eat in a day. So we can calculate straight away, if you've got a feed test, how much energy the animal's going to get from that fibre source in a day. So, you know, a good example, especially in South Australia, we just had a massive difference between our 2022 hay and our 2023 cereal hay that was cut. And just due to a wet spring, a lot of the hay just got too high, too fibrous, was cut a bit late, and there was plenty of it that got wet as well. So basically with your 22 hay, I've just used some average figures of what I've seen around the place. So we basically had 68% NDF was pretty common for our 22 hay, which is pretty close to what we normally cut straw at as a fibre level. 23 hay, so basically cut a lot earlier. The crop was a lot shorter. As the plant matures, the NDF level goes up. So we're able to cut hay at more like 55% NDF. So using that equation with the 22 hay, I've done your 120 divided by 68%. If you use your percent button on your phone or calculator, it'll spit it out with the correct decimal point. So we've ended up basically working out that they can eat 1.76% of their body weight. So I'm just going to do the example on a 65 kilo standard reference weight ewe, which means that ewe can eat 1.15 kilos of dry matter of that hay a day. Now, the average energy of our 22 hay was back as well, just because the plant got too mature, too fibrous, the cell innards and the energy started to decrease. So we ended up with around 8 megajoules per kilo of energy average on cereal hay. So we can basically times that energy figure, the megajoules per kilo dry matter, by the dry matter they can get per day, which means if that hay is fully ab lib, they're going to get 9.2 megajoules per day of energy. Now, comparing that to the 23 hay, going through the same equation. So as I said, much less fibrous, 55%. You know, the example I just showed you was less again at 51. But yeah, so using 120 divided by 55%, we come up with 2.18% of body weight that can be consumed in a day. So straight away, just due to the lower fibre, we're going to get 1.42 kilos of dry matter per day that those 65 kilo ewes will be able to eat of that hay. And now our energy was also a lot better in 23 hay. So quite a lot of people were able to cut hay at around 10 megajoules per kilo dry matter energy. So total energy in a day of that hay was 14.2 megajoules per day of energy. So as you can see, if you're putting out cereal hay to, you know, even maintain ewes year on year without feed testing, in 22, basically a 65 kilo ewe, is going to lose condition. And in 23, you're going to get them through to, you know, 120 or 130 days of gestation as a single on the same sort of hay, but just cut in a different season with different nutritional specs. So that's the value of sort of testing your hay. And it means you can back off in other ingredients because we're able to keep condition or put on a condition score even with just ad lib hay. So, you know, then we have the shortfall. So, you know, the easiest rations to do are probably when people have varying grades of fibre. So some straw, some high quality hay, maybe some medium quality hay. But, you know, a lot of people don't have that luxury. So if you've got only the one or two types of hay, where we go then, if we don't have other fodder like silage or lucerne or vetch hay, which is often higher energy again, higher protein and lower NDF level, we start to look at grain as potentially topping up that shortfall of energy. So, you know, I've given you a few average grain figures, but once again, just encouraging you to really feed test your grain if you can. So yeah, my preference is probably your barley and oat cereal grains, just due to their safety around starch. But, you know, due to the higher quality fibre this year, we're definitely putting in a lot less grain. So you can get away with some wheat or triticale if you're experienced at feeding sort of higher starch grains. And then there's some other grains like lupins, peas and beans that, as I said, with a lower protein fibre type, sometimes you do need to put in small quantities of something like lupins because it will just give you that real boost of protein to help you hit your protein targets again. So, you look at your lupin there at 32% protein, where, your barley grains averaging around 10 to 11% of the stuff I've tested this year, and oats often lower again. So, yeah, it's pretty much just looking at the ingredients and, we're trying to basically supply exactly what that ewe needs from the resources or fodder we've got available on our farm, or, potentially stuff we can buy in locally at a reasonable cost. So I guess the balance is, I've talked a lot about the nutritional side of how we're trying to meet requirements in containment, but we've still got to look back to the cost of these supplements. And, this year is a harder year to do sort of containment ewe rations because the fibre price, like good quality cereal hay, has gone up, to significant pricing. And when I compare it, I compare basically dollars or cents per megajoules of energy, and barley does come up cheaper than hay at this point in time. But yeah, it's that real way up between cost per megajoule of energy, but also hitting protein targets and also keeping fibre high enough and grain low enough that we're not going to encounter too many health issues. And I guess also remembering the fact that ewes need to go back on paddock feed, so we want them on enough fibre that their rumen's still set up to adjust back to a grazing sort of environment. But yeah, there is that real way up. There's a really good New South Wales DPI app that you can use that allows you to easily compare the cost of sort of grains and fodder, depending on what you're paying for it per tonne. It'll work it out into cents per megajoule of energy and also cost per unit of protein. So that can be a really good way to compare ingredients, especially if you're buying them in. So, just wanting to remind you guys that when we're looking at feeding ewes, we've got all these different tools in our toolbox. So we've got the feed test technology available. And, I even look at people buying hay, like make sure you have a feed test before you buy it, because as suppliers are running out, we're seeing all this older hay coming on the market, and, often it's at a very similar cost per tonne. But when you look at a feed test, you've just got a huge variation in nutritional value difference for the same cost basically per tonne. The next one is condition scoring. So, massive advocate, as I said, the whole purpose of this process is that you get some ewes through to successfully lamb. So, I don't want to feed pens and pens of twin-bearing ewes and then mark, 120% out of those mobs sort of below industry standards. So, my feeling is if we're going to be putting all this effort into feeding them, we want to feed them right to correct condition score targets and make sure we're actually getting the result we want in the lambing paddocks at the end. So, if you haven't done condition scoring, we're feeling that coverage between the sort of ends of the short ribs there. We can see in that image through to the backbone and the eye muscle coverage in between. That's the reproductive reserves of that ewe. And, there's huge correlations between condition score at lambing, lamb survival, reduced ewe mortality. Encourage you to do a lifetime ewe course or get a consultant or someone out that can help you sort of learn to condition score. So you recognise if those ewes are sort of above or below where you need them to be, especially in containment. So, hitting those targets, but also remembering, with a pen of twins that are, at score 3.3, the data shows that there's going to be 15 to 20% of those that are going to be below that condition score. So, often in containment, because they're in a more intensive pen environment, it actually does give you that opportunity to manage the tail as well. So, commonly during early to mid-pregnancy, post-scanning, I'll be helping people draft off skinnies and we'll be feeding them a slightly better ration because that's our opportunity to get, you know, a high proportion of our ewes to lamb at the target score we're after, and that's where we see the results. So I'll just step you through, and I'm going to use a similar NDF equation I just showed you, but how, you know, what ration are we going to use to maintain 65 kilo twin bearing ewes at day 130 of pregnancy. So, you know, if they're lambing paddocks close, that's the last week I'd have them in, generally in containment, because I like them to go out sort of a week to two prior to lambing if possible. But, you know, this year, you know, we are probably seeing ewes stay into the pointy end. Depending on when the break comes, that timing can often change when the feed's likely to be in the lambing paddock. So, you know, when I look at a 65 kilo twin bearing ewe, their energy requirement per day is 16.2 megajoules per head per day of energy. And then I'm going to be targeting around that 13 to 14% protein at that point in time as well, because I have got those two fetuses on board. So as we just step through, looking at the hay I just showed you, 120 divided by NDF of 55% means that ewe will be able to eat 2.18% of their body weight in dry matter. So for a 65 kilo ewe, that's 1.42 kilos of dry matter of hay they're going to eat in a day. And as I said, because we've got that 10% sort of water component in that hay, it means we actually need to feed them 1.57 kilos per day as fed for them to get that 1.42 kilos of dry matter out of that hay. And, you know, as I said earlier, the easiest part about using this equation is that means you can have this cereal hay out there 7 days a week, and that's all they're going to be able to access just because of the sheer reduction of intake due to the fibre in that feed. So, you know, we're getting then at 14.2 megajoules per day from cereal hay, which has been a real positive this year because of the high quality fibre. So when we look at our shortfall, we needed 16.2 megajoules of energy. We're getting 14.2 from the hay. That ewe actually only needs 2 megajoules per day in energy extra to meet requirements. So you can imagine with 22 hay, where we're only getting a little bit over 9, we would have had a shortfall of 7. So that's a huge difference fibre quality plays on your containment rations. So barley energy is at 13.2 megajoules per kilo dry matter. That's a pretty standard sort of 13.2 to 13.6 I'm seeing this year. So we simply just divide 2 by the 13.2, and we basically need 150 grams of barley a day dry matter or 170 grams a day as fed. So that means, you know, those ewes are just getting that small quantity of barley to top up their energy a day. So per ewe per day, we're going to be providing 1.57 kilos of hay, which is just added in the pen. And then every day we're going to give them 170 grams of barley. Or, you know, once they're introduced, you can double that and just feed them, you know, 340 grams every second day. And they're still getting their sort of daily energy spread out every second day. So that can work well till they get to the point of lambing. And the total cost of that ration is going to be 44 cents for the hay. So, you know, at elevated hay prices, that is really adding up, and 4.8 cents per day for the barley, giving you a total ewe per day cost of 48.8 cents. And, you know, that's some of the reason I like to have your singles and twins split up and fed separately, because your twin bearing rations, especially at that pointy end, start to get a lot more expensive than a single ewe bearing ration. So just touching on that, once the ewes get to the point of lambing, the problem with feeding high fibre rations for your twin bearing ewes is they actually do end up with reduced rumen space just because of the sheer space those two fetuses are taking up. So, you know, I am inclined at the point of lambing, even with higher quality cereal hay, I'd still be increasing barley in that ration to the point of lambing, just knowing they're not going to consume quite that quantity of hay when those fetuses are quite large. So I'm just going to touch on some of the other things, and I guess within this slide I'm going to talk about some of those sort of health issues we're trying to avoid. So, containment feeding, a really great tool, but on some places we do find we end up with sort of overfat use, some acidosis, hypocalcemia, and often we end up with sort of higher mortality than if we'd run them in the paddock. And I think that classic thing is that they're overfed. We haven't worked out energy calculations. We just think they're happy if they keep getting food. But they end up basically fat, not fit. And you've just got to remember that they've still got to push out a lamb. So, one of the first things I've got there is buffers. So, when we're feeding these sort of rations, especially in years where we're feeding straw or lower quality fibre and the grain portion is starting to push up, buffers for acidosis can be really useful. So, I probably see a lot of health issues that occur in containment, and a lot of it is due to that grain introduction. So we're putting in the high starch grain too quickly, or we're feeding too much grain just every second or third day. And basically they're getting that rumen upset, so it's going into that acidic environment. You're not always getting huge symptoms, but sometimes it's that subclinical acidosis that we're seeing. Other sort of issues occur, maybe checks in immunity, things like stargazing, which can be due to sort of inadequate rumen function that then leads to B1 deficiency because the rumen's not going to then be producing B1, and a lot of it is just due to the grain. So, if you're feeding, my general rule of thumb is once you start to get over sort of 500 to 600 grams of cereal grain per ewe per day, I start to include rumen buffers. I really like acid buff, and especially in cell feeders, or if you're feeding in a trough, I'd be inclined just to put a buffer pellet, so some of your feedlot pellets, which will have your microminerals, macrominerals, and vitamins in as well. I start to think it's worth putting that in with the grain, just so you're getting full coverage of all of those issues. Now, the next one I talk a lot about is calcium deficiency. We ran a 3-year project sort of following containment use through those real dry years, so 19, 20 and 21. And what we saw with the excessive grain that was fed in some of those rations, basically all your cereal grains and your hays are really high in phosphorus and really low in calcium. And what we want anytime we've got an animal growing or a pregnant ewe, we basically want 2 parts calcium and 1 part phosphorus. And what we find with a lot of these rations is it's the other way around. So as ewes come into lambing, they start to draw on their bone reserves, and you'll find they'll go down with something called hypocalcemia, which is just sheerly calcium deficiency. They run out of bone reserves. You'll see them often drop in the back legs. They'll sort of sit down and not get back up. And that's just due to that imbalanced ration through that period. So I'm a strong advocate to have calcium out anytime you've got ewes on cereal hay or cereal grain, just to make sure we don't get those issues. So magnesium, you can have similar issues, but magnesium requirement really goes up just prior to the point of lambing, and it's really involved in that muscle function as they do lamb. So, I probably don't put in a heap of magnesium earlier, but as we're coming up sort of 4 to 6 weeks from the point of lambing, I'd want to make sure we've got adequate magnesium in that diet as well. But, when I talk the macromineral side, it really is understanding the deficiencies in the feed you're feeding as well. So, when we look at macrominerals, we're basically trying to balance out whatever's not in that feed that you've put in your ration. And same with microminerals. So, it really is just assessing where your deficiencies are. So, your microminerals are things like your cobalt, copper, manganese, selenium and zinc. So they're often involved in sort of fertility, immunity, wool growth, and you can have other sort of issues and diseases if you've got deficiencies. But generally, I just like to know, if you're on quite sandy soil, your potentially animals are coming in with a bit of a deficiency anyway. or if your feed types are growing on soil with some of these deficiencies, it'll come through into your feed types. So, you know, my idea really with microminerals is assess where the deficiencies might be. And if they're on containment feed for a long period of time, then it can be worth balancing out some of those things. And, you know, if you're joining in containment, animals have been on a supplementary diet for quite a while, then, you know, I would also look at adding in microminerals just because it will help with that sperm and egg development as well, and that fertility and joining sort of process. And the last one is vitamins. So, you know, you've got some vitamins that are happily sort of synthesized with the rumen. So you've got things like the B vitamins I touched on before. So if your rumen's operating effectively, you'll be synthesizing your own sort of B vitamins. But if you do have that inadequate rumen function, some acidosis, worms or disease, you may find you do have a deficiency. Same as vitamin C, that's synthesized by the rumen. Vitamin E is probably the one I concentrate on mostly, and that's probably just because they do require a daily quantity of it. And also, it's in green feed, but if they've been off green feed or on supplementary feed for a month, you can start to see some deficiencies. So, you know, that is something I think if you're containment feeding for over a month, I'd start to look at potentially having some vitamin E in there. But yeah, with a lot of these products, you'll get your feedlot pellets that'll have most of your macros, micros and vitamins in that you need per day, or you can get good sort of pre-lambing loose legs that will give you everything you need on that side as well. But just finishing up on the water quality side, so I guess whenever we talk nutrition in containment, I like to really understand what the ewes are getting from their water source as well. So we've got in the left-hand column here the water salinity measured in parts per million. So, you know, generally I'd recommend under 5,000 parts when you've got ewes in containment, but there obviously are some cases that you'll have water a bit higher, but you do need to remember that sort of at 5,000 parts, that ewe is going to get all the salt it needs. So you definitely wouldn't be putting any salt-based feedlot pellets or salt-based loose legs to supply your vitamin mineral requirements we just went through. You know, once you get up towards 10,000, it's starting to be unsuitable really for lambs, calves, weaners, you know, and I'd be really careful with pregnant and lactating stock as well. And then you've got similar with your magnesium. So we're just wanting magnesium under 600 parts per million. If you haven't done a water test, I use APOW in South Australia. You can basically just send a small sample in. I think it's around $99 a sample, and you'll get a full breakdown of vitamin minerals and your salinity and things that are coming through with your water. So just in summary with some key take homes, basically the first thing I want you to look at is what do my stock need to meet targets. So, you know, that's the energy and protein charts we went through at the start. So, you know, if you've done a lifetime ewe course, there's some brilliant lifetime wool tables that are invaluable when you're trying to feed pregnant stock. And as I said, it just is that difficulty with the ration basically changing every 10 days. And then the next box is, you know, what feed is available and what's the most economical to supplement with. But I guess now with, you know, 10 years experience in containment feeding, not always going for the cheapest option, which, you know, in most years is straw and barley, but we've also got to look at those health factors. So the imbalances that come with some feeds and also keeping fibre high to keep that rumen healthy and avoiding issues like acidosis that I find have flow-on effects. The next one, you know, assess to ensure your targets are being met across all stock. So, you know, we can look up charts and we can satisfy it exactly to the T, but there are stock that do slightly different on different rations, that we've got better doers, we've got poor doers. So realistically, your condition scoring and assessing that you're actually getting the result you need is absolutely critical when you're feeding them everything that they require in that pen. And then the last thing is consider your mineral needs to avoid issues. So, I think the most frustrating thing when we've tracked containment fed ewes is when you've spent all this money and time on feeding them, and 5% of your ewes, and it's always your twin bearers, fall over with hypocalcemia. So can't emphasise enough, especially with long-term containment, just making sure every mouthful they eat is balanced, and you're avoiding sort of potential issues and getting that result you need, basically at the other end around lambing. So we're targeting, high lamb survival and basically lower ewe mortality, not the other way around. But yeah, thanks very much for your time. I think we've got a bit of time for some questions. I'll hand back over to Jodie, but also my details are there if anyone has any queries down the track with containment feeding. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Deb, a couple of questions. I'm about to contain my ewes. What vaccinations should I undertake?
Yeah, so probably one of the critical ones is just your pulpy kidney vaccination. So, even just a 3-in-1 will cover you for pulpy kidney. And I guess just because often it's, they've eaten depleted stubbles or they're on quite dry feed, and then pulpy kidney risk is always with that feed change. So as you start increasing their nutrition, I'd make sure they're basically covered for pulpy. The timing with containment fed ewes is often they'll have their annual booster while they're in the pens, recommended 4 to 6 weeks prior to lambing. But yeah, often they need that extra sort of pulpy boost before they're due for their annual booster.
Great, thanks for that. And I might just flag there, we did a webinar a month ago with Colin Tringove on health issues with containment. So jump on the Sheep Connect AWI Extension YouTube channel and you can view that one there if you had some other health, in particular questions. Penny, you had a couple of questions come through to you. Did you want to pose those?
No worries. Thank you, and well done, Deb. That was excellent. I just had a couple come through. So, what about lambing in containment? Is that advisable? What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, so I think, as we talk about setting up ewe containment pens, there's always been that recommendation of greater than 20 square metres per ewe. But, I personally don't love lambing in containment pens where the ewes have been. But just because you've got all that manure and, material that realistically I wouldn't be wanting to drop a young lamb on. And unfortunately, out of necessity with some clients, we've basically had to lamb in dry times areas, I guess. But, I'd be tempted to fence off 4 acres of scrub somewhere else, and then I physically move those lambing ewes into that. They're still on supplementary feed, but a different area than your basically containment pen that you've fed for months.
And then follow up is what are the protocols you put in place for the transition out of containment, particularly for lambing ewes?
Yeah, so the hardest part realistically with lambing ewes is that huge difference in nutrition. So, and especially when we look at things like wool, if we have that sudden change in diet, we do see that staple change, and you will sort of often get a wool break with the sort of micron changing with the change of nutrition. So, yeah, realistically, it's best if you can sort of transition them off the feed just as you have them on. So, I like to think of 10 to 14 days. In an ideal world, you'd have them let out of their containment pen and grazing a bit of green and then coming back in for 10 days. But, in a late break year, it gets really tricky to manage because often they're moved to containment and don't always have feed there year on year. So, I'd be tempted just to put them out if you're getting too close to lambing, and then we follow them with the same feed type. So they'll have the same hay and same grain feeder. And, in an ideal world, they'll transition slowly onto that grain feed.
Thanks, Deb. Another one here, Deb. With the price and availability of hay now, what's the upper limit of grain that I can feed to my ewes in containment?
Yeah, so as I said, there's a few different nutritionists that potentially give you slightly different answers for this. Yeah, I just feel like with the 10 years I've done with containment feeding, some of the increased ewe mortality we've seen in some flocks, I've probably become even more pedantic over the years about keeping fibre up. So, I realistically don't love having twins on too much more than a kilo of cereal grain a day. And you know, that's in years where we do have that lower quality fibre, like the 22 hay, and the only way we can meet energy requirements is with that sort of quantity of grain. And as I said, with twins, as they run out of gut space, we actually do need more energy dense feed and less fibrous feed, because otherwise they just physically can't get it in. But yeah, I mean, there's cases I've gone slightly over that, but you know, I don't love having ewes on, you know, 1.5 kilos of grain for a long period of time, because I just find those metabolic issues become really hard to control.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you for that. That's the questions I've got. I'd like to extend my thanks to the funders of these webinars, the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund, the Government of South Australia, Livestock SA, the South Australian Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub, and Australian Wool Innovations Extension SA. I'd also like to thank you guys for joining us for today's webinar. Deb, thank you to you for sharing your insight and expertise with us. I thank you all and have a lovely evening.